His farm dog refused to enter the barn at night. When the owner ignored the desperate warnings and went in alone, he collapsed, learning why Scout sensed invisible death. The Idaho sunset bled crimson and gold over Ben Walker's weathered fence line, staining the snowy fields in long, cold shadows. Ben, 50s, his movements stiff from old shrapnel scars and colder winters, heaved the last bale of hay into the feed trough. His breath fogged the brittle air. "Come on, Scout," he called, his voice gravelly but warm. "Barn's closed." Scout, a lanky collie mix with one ear permanently cocked like a question mark, usually bounded ahead, a black and white streak against the dusk. Tonight, he shot past Ben toward the barn's wide, sliding door, then skidded to a halt 5 feet short. His entire body went rigid. A low, vibrating whine escaped his throat, sharp enough to cut through the settling quiet. Ben frowned, trudging forward. "What's got your tail in a knot, boy?" As Ben reached for the heavy door handle, Scout lunged. Not forward, but sideways, planting himself squarely between Ben and the entrance. The dog trembled violently, eyes wide and fixed on the dark crack beneath the door. He pressed his weight against Ben's knees, a living, shivering barricade. Ben sighed, the sound heavy with weary patience. He rubbed a calloused hand over his close-cropped gray hair. "Not again, Scout," he murmured, nudging gently. The dog didn't budge. An inch of weathered wood and Scout's palpable terror stood between Ben and the familiar dusty warmth of his barn. 6 months ago, Ben wouldn't have had the patience. 6 months ago, the barn's shadows felt like the alleyways of Kandahar, potential ambush points lurking in every corner. He'd found Scout during one of those bad spells, a desperate drive to clear his head that ended on a dirt track near the county dump. The dog had been little more than fur stretched over bone, curled in a muddy ditch, ribs stark against matted fur. One eye was swollen shut, and he hadn't even lifted his head as Ben's truck idled nearby. Just a faint, hopeless whimper. Ben saw himself in that ditch, broken, discarded after his own service. He'd wrapped the trembling creature in his old field jacket and driven straight to Doc Evans's clinic. Scout's recovery mirrored Ben's own slow climb. The dog gained weight. His coat grew thick and soft, a mix of black, white, and russet gold. The wary look in his eyes softened, replaced by a devotion so fierce it sometimes stole Ben's breath. In return, Ben found anchors in their routine. Dawn meant chores. Scout herding the small flock of sheep with innate, joyful precision. Ben mending fences or tending the vegetable patch. Evenings were for the barn, oiling tack, stacking feed, and coaxing life back into the cantankerous vintage propane heater that warmed the space where orphaned lambs sometimes slept. It was a relic, that heater, cast iron and temperamental, much like Ben himself. Fixing it was a puzzle, a tactile distraction from the ghosts that sometimes rattled his nerves. Scout was always there. While Ben tinkered, the dog would patrol the barn's perimeter, nose to the ground, a silent sentry. Or he'd curl up on an old horse blanket near the workbench, a warm, breathing presence that anchored Ben in the present. The nightmares, the hypervigilance that had him jumping at slamming screen doors. Scout absorbed it. A nudge of a wet nose during a flashback, the solid weight leaning against his leg during a thunderstorm. The barn, filled with the scent of hay, oil, and Scout's warm fur, became a sanctuary. It was peace, hard-won and fragile. Scout wasn't just a dog. He was the quiet promise that the shadows held nothing but dust and memories now. Tonight, however, the peace shattered. As Ben tried again to gently push past Scout's blockade, the dog's whine escalated into a high-pitched keen, raw with panic. He didn't just lean. He shoved his full weight against Ben's thighs, paws scrabbling for purchase on the frozen ground. "Scout, enough!" Ben's voice cracked, sharper than he intended, frustration bubbling up. The temperature was plummeting, the lambs inside needed checking, and the damned heater needed a final adjustment before the real cold set in. He took a firmer step towards the door. Scout reacted instantly. With a speed that blurred his shape, he darted behind Ben and clamped his jaws not on flesh, but firmly on the thick cuff of Ben's worn Carhartt jacket. Then he pulled, digging his hind legs in, dragging Ben backward with surprising strength. Ben stumbled, caught off guard. "Hey, Scout, let go!" Ben commanded, trying to twist around, anger flaring. He raised a hand, not to strike, but in reflexive protest. The motion caught the fading light. Ben froze. Not because of his own raised hand, but because of what he saw in Scout's eyes. It wasn't disobedience, not the playful stubbornness when he didn't want a bath. This was pure, unadulterated terror. The white showed around Scout's wide, dark pupils. His lips were drawn back not in a snarl, but in a silent rictus of fear. Every muscle in the dog's body was locked tight, quivering like a plucked wire. He released Ben's sleeve, but instantly repositioned himself, a trembling wall between Ben and the barn door, panting rapid, shallow breaths that puffed white into the freezing air. A thin, distressed whine vibrated continuously in his throat. The anger evaporated, replaced by a cold trickle of unease that had nothing to do with the Idaho night. This wasn't stubbornness. This was primal fear. Ben looked from Scout's terrified face to the barn door. It was just wood and darkness. The familiar scent of hay and animals drifted out. Nothing looked amiss. No strange sounds, no flickering lights. He knelt slowly, ignoring the protest in his bad knee. "Easy, boy," he murmured, holding out a placating hand. Scout flinched but didn't retreat, his gaze darting between Ben's face and the barn door, then back again. His body remained rigidly blocking the path. He whined again, a sound that seemed to say, "Don't. Please don't." Ben rested a hand on Scout's heaving flank, feeling the frantic drumbeat of the dog's heart against his palm. The terror was real, contagious. He scanned the barn exterior again, weathered planks, frost-rimmed windows reflecting the dying sunset. Nothing. Yet Scout acted like a monster lurked behind that door. A monster only he could sense. "Why Scout?" Ben whispered, the question hanging heavy in the freezing air, his breath a plume of white confusion. "What in God's name are you seeing? Why won't you let me in?" The sanctuary felt suddenly alien, its familiar silhouette menacing under the vast, indifferent sky. The dog's silent, trembling vigil offered no answers, only a dread that seeped deep into Ben's bones. The peace was broken, replaced by a chilling mystery wrapped in fur and fear. The next morning dawned brittle and bright, sunlight glaring off the frost-encrusted fields. Ben slid the barn door open with deliberate force, daylight flooding the dusty interior. Scout trotted in beside him, tail wagging, nose already busy investigating familiar scents. Hay, leather, the faint tang of motor oil. He showed no trace of last night's terror. Ben watched him closely, the knot of unease still tight in his gut. He conducted a methodical sweep, honed by years of patrols. He checked every stall, peered into shadowed corners behind tractors and stacked sacks of grain, climbed creaking ladders to inspect the hayloft. Nothing. No trapped raccoon hissing from a corner, no downed bird fluttering desperately. He checked the small window latches, all secure. He even sniffed the air deeply, searching for the telltale rotten egg scent of propane, but smelled only dust and dry hay. The heater, a hulking cast-iron beast in the corner, sat cold and silent, its pilot light out, as usual. Nothing out of place. Nothing threatening. "See, boy?" Ben murmured, running a hand along a worn wooden beam. "Nothing but ghosts in your head." Scout, busy nosing at a forgotten grain spill, thumped his tail absently. Later, over a shared lunch of thick beef stew at his neighbor Hank's cluttered kitchen table, Ben described the previous night. Hank, a grizzled third-generation rancher with eyes perpetually squinted against the wind, listened while methodically cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "Sounds like he's warning you, Ben," Hank stated, snapping the knife shut. "Animals know things we don't. My granddaddy's hound wouldn't set paw in the south pasture for a week, for old man Jenkins dropped dead out there. Knew the reaper was lingering." "Reaper?" Ben raised an eyebrow, pushing a chunk of potato around his bowl. "In my barn?" "Spirits, then," Hank shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Place is old, could be restless. Or," he leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "could be wolves testing the boundaries. Smell the sheep. Scout's warning you off 'cause he knows something's out there waiting." He nodded sagely. "Smart dog. Best listen." Ben drove home, Hank's words echoing. Spirits, wolves. It felt absurd under the stark afternoon sun. Yet, as evening approached, a familiar dread began to coil in Ben's stomach. He watched Scout. The dog spent the afternoon sunning himself peacefully on the porch, gnawing contentedly on a beef knuckle. He herded the sheep back to their pen with cheerful efficiency, darting and circling, his focus absolute. No anxiety, no glancing towards the barn. The fear only ignited with the dying light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples, Scout's demeanor shifted. He stopped playing with a stray stick. His ears pricked forward, then swiveled towards the barn. The relaxed set of his shoulders vanished, replaced by a tense alertness. He stood slowly, a low rumble starting deep in his chest as he stared at the looming structure. The transformation was chilling. Daytime Scout was a goofy, loyal companion. Nighttime Scout was a sentinel guarding the gates of hell. Ben felt a surge of frustration mixed with helplessness. What unseen switch flipped when darkness fell? He stood beside Scout on the porch, both staring at the barn. The rational part of his mind dismissed Hank's ghosts and wolves. But the veteran part, the part that knew terror could wear 1,000 invisible faces, whispered that Scout sensed something. Something Ben couldn't see, hear, or smell. Something that terrified the dog enough to defy his beloved master. The mystery deepened, wrapping the familiar barn in an unsettling shroud. Rationality, Ben decided, required data. Ghosts and wolves belonged around campfires, not in his practical world. 2 days later, a package arrived in town, a pair of military-grade night vision cameras with motion sensors and infrared capability. Old habits died hard when faced with an unseen threat. Observe and assess. He spent the afternoon mounting them, one high in the rafters near the main door, offering a wide-angle view of the barn's entrance and the heater corner, the other lower down, focused specifically on the area where Scout always seemed to fixate, the space near the vintage heater and the stacked hay bales opposite it. The cameras were small, black, unobtrusive eyes in the shadows. That night, Ben waited inside the farmhouse, the feed from both cameras displayed side by side on his old laptop. He dimmed the lights, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside him. Scout paced restlessly near the back door, whining softly, his eyes fixed on the path to the barn. On screen, the infrared view painted the barn interior in ghostly greens and grays. Empty stalls, the hulking shape of the tractor, the stacked hay bales like monoliths. The heater was a dark, cold mass. Nothing moved. Minutes ticked by. Ben's eyes grew heavy. Then Scout's form appeared on the screen near the door. Ben had let him out, unable to bear the pacing inside. The dog entered cautiously, tail low, body tense. He moved a few steps into the barn and stopped, sniffing the air intently. His head swiveled towards the heater corner. Suddenly, Scout's body coiled. A snarl ripped from his throat, audible even through the laptop's tinny speakers, a sound of pure, feral aggression, Ben had never heard from him. The dog lunged, not forward, but sideways and up, snapping viciously at the empty air about 4 feet off the ground, near the stacked hay bales. He landed, spun, and lunged again, teeth bared, snarling at nothing, at a patch of empty space bathed in the eerie green glow of the camera. He repeated this 3 times, frantic, targeted lunges at thin air, punctuated by guttural growls that vibrated through the feed. Ben leaned closer, heart pounding. He rewound the footage, watched it again, and again. Scout wasn't chasing a bat or a moth. He was attacking emptiness. The space was utterly vacant. No shadow, no distortion, no floating dust motes catching the IR light differently. Just the dog, in the grip of absolute terror or fury, assaulting nothingness. He looked from the screen to Scout, who had retreated to the barn doorway, still trembling, hackles raised, staring fixedly at the same corner he'd just attacked. Ben felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night. He walked out to the barn, ignoring Scout's renewed whines. He stood where Scout had lunged. He waved his hands through the air. Nothing. He sniffed. Hay dust, cold metal, the faint oily smell of machinery. Nothing unusual. He knelt beside Scout, who pressed against his leg, shivering uncontrollably. Ben stroked the dog's head, running his fingers through the thick fur around his neck. "What's wrong with you, buddy?" he murmured, his voice thick with confusion and a dawning worry. The cameras hadn't solved the mystery. They'd deepened it. Scout wasn't just scared. He was seeing an enemy Ben couldn't perceive. Was it madness? Or was there truly something in his barn that only the dog could sense? The rational world Ben clung to felt dangerously thin. The cold snap hit 3 nights later. It wasn't just cold, it was a predatory freeze that clawed through layers of clothing and seeped into bones. The weather radio blared warnings, temperatures plummeting to life-threatening lows, wind chills turning exposed skin to ice in minutes. Ben's breath hung thick in the farmhouse air, despite the furnace roaring. His flock of pregnant ewes was housed in the barn's most sheltered corner, but even their thick fleeces wouldn't be enough against this brutal cold without supplemental heat. The vintage heater had to work. Ben had tried lighting it briefly the day before, but it had coughed, sputtered a sickly yellow flame, and died. The thermocouple, he suspected, or maybe a blocked line. A quick fix, usually. But Scout hadn't allowed him near it after dark. Tonight, the stakes weren't just about his own chores or comfort. Lambs, vulnerable, new life, depended on that barn staying above freezing. He couldn't afford Scout's phobia. He bundled up, layers of thermal wear, thick flannel, his heavy Carhartt jacket, wool hat pulled low. He grabbed his toolbox and a powerful flashlight. Scout, sensing his intent, materialized at the back door, a low whine already building in his throat. "Easy, Scout," Ben said, his voice firm but gentle. "Gotta do this, boy. The sheep need warmth." As soon as Ben stepped onto the porch, Scout darted ahead, not towards the barn, but to block the path, his body rigid, the whine escalating into a high-pitched keen. The frigid air seemed to amplify the sound, sharp and desperate. "Move, Scout," Ben commanded, trying to step around him. The dog mirrored his movement instantly, planting himself firmly, trembling violently. He didn't snap, but the message was clear. No further. "Scout! Heel!" Ben used his most authoritative voice, the one that usually made the dog fall instantly into step. Scout ignored it. He pressed forward, not aggressively, but pleadingly, nudging Ben's toolbox hand with his nose, then trying to gently grasp the cuff of his jacket to pull him back towards the house. His eyes were wide, pleading pools of reflected moonlight. Frustration, sharp and cold, surged through Ben. Time was critical. The vulnerable lambs couldn't wait for canine neurosis. "I don't have time for this," he snapped, his voice harsh in the frozen stillness. He couldn't risk Scout biting him in his panic or darting into the barn after him into whatever phantom menace he perceived. His decision felt like a betrayal, even as he made it. He marched back to the small enclosed kennel run attached to the side of the house, seldom used since Scout had free roam. He opened the chain-link gate. Scout, kennel, now. Scout hesitated, whining, looking from Ben to the barn. "Now!" Ben roared, the sound startling in the icy silence. Cowed, ears flat, tail tucked impossibly low, Scout slunk into the kennel. Ben shut the gate and secured the latch with cold-numbed fingers. The look Scout gave him through the wire mesh, a mixture of profound hurt, terror, and utter betrayal, pierced Ben's heart. "Stay," Ben ordered, the word tasting like ash. "I'll be quick." He turned and strode towards the barn, the beam of his flashlight cutting a shaky path through the darkness. Behind him, Scout's whine turned into something else, a long, mournful, soul-rending howl. It wasn't loud, but it carried on the still, frozen air, a sound of pure, animal despair. It echoed off the farmhouse, a haunting counterpoint to the crunch of Ben's boots on the frost-hardened ground. It was the sound of a creature witnessing its beloved master walk willingly into the jaws of death. Ben flinched with every step, the howl wrapping around him like icy chains, but he didn't stop. The lambs needed heat. He pushed open the heavy barn door and stepped into the deeper darkness within, Scout's desperate cries following him like a curse. The sanctuary felt colder than the frozen world outside, heavy with the invisible threat and the weight of his dog's terror. The barn door thudded shut behind Ben, muffling but not silencing Scout's haunting howls. The sound vibrated in Ben's bones, a discordant counterpoint to the frantic drumming of his own heart. The air inside was frigid, thick with the silence of held breath and the sharp scent of hay dust disturbed by his entrance. His flashlight beam cut a trembling circle on the packed earth floor as he hurried towards the hulking shape of the heater in the far corner. Every second counted. He could already feel the brutal cold seeping through his layers, imagining the vulnerable ewes huddled in their pen. He dropped his toolbox with a clatter near the heater's base. Kneeling, the cold of the concrete floor instantly bit through his pants. He fumbled with stiff, cold fingers to remove the access panel, the metal protesting with a rusty shriek. The familiar smell of old iron and dust filled his nostrils, normal, grounding. He focused on the task. Find the blockage, clean the thermocouple, get the pilot lit. Simple, routine. He leaned closer, peering into the heater's dark maw, flashlight beam illuminating the intricate maze of pipes and valves. His breath plumed white in the cone of light. He reached in with a wrench, trying to loosen a fitting near the gas inlet. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss seemed to emanate from the pipe. Or was it just the wind finding a new crevice outside? He ignored it, concentrating on the stubborn bolt. A wave of dizziness washed over him, sudden and profound. He blinked, shaking his head slightly. Just the cold, just bending over. He repositioned the wrench, applying more pressure. Another wave hit, stronger this time. The beam of his flashlight seemed to blur at the edges. The intricate shapes inside the heater swam before his eyes. He felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, incongruous in the freezing barn. It wasn't comforting, it was heavy, suffocating. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice sounding thick and sluggish to his own ears. He tried to take a deep breath to clear his head, but the air felt thin, insubstantial. It tasted stale. Metallic? He couldn't place it. The walls of the barn seemed to tilt inwards, then recede. The stacked hay bales loomed like dark, unstable cliffs. The single bulb he'd switched on near the door seemed to pulse with a sickly, faraway light. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the gathering fog. Not now, not here. This wasn't Kandahar, this was his barn. But the feeling was terrifyingly familiar. The disconnect, the loss of control, the world dissolving into disorienting fragments. He dropped the wrench, the clang echoing strangely in the distorted acoustics. He tried to push himself up, to get to the door, to air. His legs refused to cooperate. They were leaden, numb. The warmth in his chest intensified, becoming a crushing pressure. Black spots danced at the edge of his vision, multiplying, merging. He heard a roaring sound, like distant surf, filling his skull. Was it the wind, or his own blood struggling? He managed to turn his head towards the door, a desperate plea forming in his mind. Scout! The thought fragmented. The roaring grew louder. The walls spun violently. The beam of the flashlight he dropped rolled, casting crazy, leaping shadows that seemed to mock him. His last conscious sensation was the unforgiving hardness of the concrete floor rushing up to meet his cheek. Then, nothing. Only the suffocating warmth, the roaring darkness, and the fading phantom echo of a dog's despairing cry. Outside, chained in the kennel run, Scout's mournful howl had shifted. The despair was still there, a deep, resonant thrum of terror, but layered over it was a new, frantic urgency. It wasn't a cry for Ben to come back anymore. It was a raw, piercing alarm. He threw himself against the chain-link fence, not once, but repeatedly, a black-and-white battering ram driven by pure panic. The sturdy latch, designed to hold determined strays, groaned under the focused assault. On the third desperate lunge, with a shriek of protesting metal, the latch mechanism bent, then snapped. The gate flew open. Scout didn't hesitate. He shot across the frozen yard like a bullet, a low, continuous growl rumbling in his chest, a sound of pure, focused purpose. He slammed his full weight against the barn door. It didn't budge. He scrabbled at the base, claws digging grooves in the weathered wood, whining high and sharp. He reared up, throwing his shoulder against it again. Nothing. Snout pressed to the crack beneath the door. He inhaled deeply, rapidly. His whine turned into a series of sharp staccato barks, not random, but rhythmic, insistent. Alarm, danger, help. He repeated the pattern, paused, sniffed frantically, then repeated it again, louder. He ran a frantic circle around the barn's perimeter, leaping at windows too high to reach, barking his structured alarm at the unyielding walls, before racing back to the main door to scratch and whine and bark the pattern again. Help, danger. Here. A light flicked on in Hank's farmhouse window across the field. Then another. Scout saw it. He stopped his circuit, planted himself squarely in front of Ben's house, pointed his nose towards the sky, and let loose the most piercing, sustained howl Hank had ever heard. A siren wail of pure animal desperation that cut through the frozen silence. Minutes later, headlights sliced through the darkness as Hank's battered pickup skidded to a halt in Ben's yard, followed closely by another neighbor's car. They found Scout not at the house, but back at the barn door, frantically digging at the threshold, his muzzle raw, barking that same sharp, rhythmic pattern interspersed with frantic whines. He didn't greet them. He just redoubled his efforts, scratching at the door, then looking back at the men, his eyes wide and pleading. "Something's bad wrong," Hank muttered, grabbing the door handle. It was heavy, frozen, but with the other neighbor's help, they hauled it open. The wave of air that hit them wasn't just cold. It was thick, stale, and carried a faint, sickly sweet odor beneath the hay. Scout shot past their legs into the gloom. Hank's flashlight beam found Ben first, crumpled on the floor near the silent heater, deathly pale, not moving. Then it found Scout, already there, licking Ben's face frantically, nudging his shoulder, whining. "Ben! Jesus!" Hank rushed in, the other neighbor close behind. As Hank knelt, checking for a pulse, thready but there, his flashlight beam caught the hissing pipe near the heater's base, barely visible. The neighbor, a younger man named Dave, coughed. "Air's bad in here, Hank. Real bad. Makes you lightheaded." Paramedics arrived swiftly, summoned by Dave from his car. They moved with urgent efficiency, strapping an oxygen mask onto Ben's pale face, loading him onto a stretcher. Ben stirred groggily as they lifted him, his vision swimming with blurred shapes and flashing lights. He heard snippets of tense conversation cutting through the fog in his head. Unresponsive. Core temp low. And then, clear as a bell from one paramedic to another as they passed the silent, ominous heater. Probable carbon monoxide poisoning. Miracle, he's alive this long. That dog, ... Ben's bleary eyes found Scout. The dog stood rigidly by the barn door, trembling, watching them carry Ben away, his mission seemingly complete, the terrifying enemy inside the barn momentarily forgotten. The words carbon monoxide echoed in Ben's fading consciousness as the ambulance doors slammed shut, sealing him away from the cold, the barn, and the dog who had screamed a warning into the frozen night. The sterile brightness of the ER was a jarring contrast to the barn's frozen darkness. Ben drifted in a haze of oxygen, warmth slowly seeping back into his limbs, the crushing pressure in his chest gradually easing. Vague memories flickered, Scout's howl, the frantic barking, the paramedic's words, carbon monoxide. Miracle. That dog. Guilt, thick and acrid, washed over him. He'd caged Scout. He'd walked right in. A gentle hand touched his arm. Dr. Evans, the town vet who'd patched Scout up months ago, stood by his gurney. Her usual brisk demeanor was softened by concern. "How you feelin', Ben?" Gave us quite a scare. "Alive," Ben rasped, his throat raw. "Scout?" "Scout's right here," Dr. Evans said, nodding towards the corner of the small ER cubicle. Ben turned his head. Scout sat on a clean blanket someone had provided, held gently but firmly by a young veterinary technician. The dog's eyes were fixed on Ben, his body still vibrating with residual tension, but he looked physically unharmed except for raw scrapes on his muzzle and paws. The raw relief in Scout's eyes when he saw Ben looking was almost unbearable. "Good boy," Ben whispered, the words thick with emotion. "Good boy, Scout." "He's more than good, Ben," Dr. Evans said, her voice low and serious. She moved closer to Scout, nodding to the tech. "Can you show Mr. Walker Scout's flank, Sarah?" Gently. The tech carefully guided Scout to stand and turn, parting the thick fur on his left flank, just behind his rib cage. Ben squinted. Beneath the fur, illuminated by the harsh hospital lights, were scars. Not the random nicks of a stray's life, but precise parallel lines, faded but unmistakably surgical. 3 neat incisions, about an inch long each. "We noticed these when he came in," Dr. Evans explained. "Bit too neat for fight wounds. And then there was this." She carefully lifted Scout's right ear, revealing a small, nearly invisible tattoo, a series of numbers and letters in stark black ink inside the leathery flap. "Microchip. Scanned it immediately." Ben stared, the puzzle pieces starting to click with dawning, staggering comprehension. The scars, the tattoo, the impossible behavior. Dr. Evans met Ben's gaze. "Benjamin Walker, meet Scout, formerly known as Sentinel, ID Delta 79, registered and trained by Guardian Paws Medical Alert Service out of Portland." She paused, letting it sink in. "He's a fully certified medical alert and response dog, Ben, trained specifically for diabetic alert, seizure response, and carbon monoxide detection." The air left Ben's lungs, trained, the lunging at empty corners, the desperate blockade, the frantic barks, not ghosts, not wolves, not madness. Scout was partnered with an elderly woman, Mildred Hargrove, for 5 years, Dr. Evans continued, her voice gentle. "She passed peacefully in her sleep about 8 months ago. According to the CHIP registry, Her family surrendered him to a shelter, but the records show he was adopted the next day by a John Smith. Her mouth tightened. We found no further trace until he turned up in your ditch, Ben. Someone adopted him just to dump him. Probably couldn't handle a high-drive working dog or didn't want the responsibility. The betrayal Scout must have felt twice over. Ben's vision blurred. Scout, sensing his distress, whined softly. The tech released her gentle hold, and Scout instantly crossed the small space, pressing his head against Ben's dangling hand. Not licking, nudging, insistent, checking. He'd been lunging at the scent, at the invisible, deadly poison seeping from the faulty heater. He'd been trying to alert Ben, to herd him away from the danger zone, to respond to the silent killer in the only way his training and terror allowed. He hadn't seen a monster. He'd smelled death. Ben's hand curled into Scout's fur, holding on tight. The tears he'd fought since the barn, since the kennel, since seeing that look of betrayal, finally broke free. They weren't tears of weakness now, but of overwhelming awe, crushing guilt, and a profound, humbling gratitude. He buried his face in the thick fur of Scout's neck, the dog's steady warmth, a tangible anchor. "You knew," Ben choked out, his voice muffled against Scout's coat. "You tried to tell me. You brave, brilliant, loyal boy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't listen." Scout leaned into him harder, a soft whimper vibrating in his throat. Not fear this time, but the sound of a bond reforged, stronger than steel, in the cold heart of a deadly mystery finally solved. The dog hadn't just saved Ben's life. He'd revealed the hero he'd always been, hidden beneath the scars and the sorrow. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the lingering phantom of stale metallic air in Ben's nostrils. Oxygen hissed softly through the cannula, a stark counterpoint to the frantic drumming of his heart that hadn't fully settled. Scout lay on a clean blanket beside the gurney, his head resting heavily on Ben's thigh, warm and solid. The raw scrapes on his muzzle were stark against his fur, a brutal testament to his desperate bid to be heard. Dr. Evans returned, her usual briskness softened by the gravity of the night. She held a tablet, her eyes scanning information Ben couldn't see. "Guardian Paws got back to me instantly," she began, her voice low. Full history. She looked from the screen to Scout, then to Ben. His name was Sentinel, ID Delta 79, partnered for 5 years with an elderly woman, Mildred Hargrove, diabetic, prone to nocturnal hypoglycemia. Ben's hand tightened reflexively in Scout's fur. Sentinel? The name resonated with the dog's unwavering vigilance. He alerted her? To the sugar drops? And seizures, Dr. Evans confirmed, nodding. But their programs advanced. They cross-trained for environmental hazards too, especially carbon monoxide. She tapped the tablet. They train them to detect scent anomalies humans can't perceive, the metabolic byproducts in breath and skin when CO binds to blood. It's not the gas they smell directly. It's the change in you it causes. She met Ben's gaze squarely. That lunging you saw on the camera? He wasn't attacking air. He was pinpointing the source of the scent plume, trying to alert you to the danger zone, trying to herd you away from it. Classic trained response to an invisible airborne threat. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. The focused aggression near the heater, not madness, but mapping. The frantic barks outside the barn, not random panic, but a structured alarm call, a plea for help he'd been drilled to give. The utter terror wasn't for himself. It was the sheer, desperate frustration of seeing his person walk into a death trap he could smell but couldn't physically stop. And then the final, chilling detail. The family surrendered him to a shelter after Mildred passed peacefully, Dr. Evans added, her mouth a tight line. John Smith adopted him the next day. Record stopped there. Until he turned up in your ditch, Ben, someone adopted a highly trained medical asset just to dump him like trash when he became inconvenient. The image of Scout, ribs stark against matted fur, one eye swollen shut, curled in that muddy ditch, flooded Ben's mind. Not just broken, but betrayed. Abandoned after giving everything. Twice over. The depth of that cruelty stole Ben's breath far more effectively than the CO had. A ragged sound tore from Ben's throat, half sob, half gasp. The weight of it crashed down. Scout's past suffering, his own stubborn dismissal, the sheer, terrifying proximity of the end he'd walked into blindly. He looked down at the dog whose unwavering gaze held only concern, only the echo of that desperate need to protect. "Oh, God, Scout," Ben choked out, his voice thick and broken. He slid his good arm off the gurney, burying his face in the thick, warm fur of the dog's neck. The dam holding back weeks of frustration, helplessness, and the cold dread of the barn shattered. Tears, hot and shameful, soaked into Scout's ruff. "I caged you, I locked you up, when all you were doing was trying to save me." Each word was a jagged shard. "I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry, boy. I didn't listen. I didn't understand." Scout whined softly, a low, vibrating sound deep in his chest. He didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted, nudging Ben's wet cheek gently with his cool nose. Then, tentatively, a warm, rough tongue swept across Ben's temple, catching a tear. It wasn't playful. It was solace, an instinctive response to distress. A silent, "It's okay, I'm here." Ben held on tighter, the feel of Scout's solid warmth, his steady heartbeat against Ben's arm, a lifeline. In that moment, the parallels were blindingly clear. Scout, discarded after a lifetime of service, left to rot in a ditch. Ben, scarred by war, haunted by ghosts, struggling to find purpose on the quiet edge of the world. Two broken creatures, bearing the invisible wounds of abandonment and trauma. Scout's trauma, the shattering of his purpose, his bond, had met Ben's, the echoes of combat, the isolation. And in that collision, in the silent, desperate language of fear and protection, neither fully grasped at first, they hadn't just found each other, they had saved each other. Scout gave Ben a reason to face the dawn, a routine, a warm weight against the nightmares. And Ben, unwittingly, had given Scout a person to guard, a purpose reborn in the scent of hay and oil, a bond forged anew in the cold Idaho night. The dog who smelled death had breathed life back into them both. Ben lifted his head slightly, meeting Scout's dark, watchful eyes, still glistening with his own tears. He saw the intelligence, the deep well of loyalty, the echoes of past pain, and the fierce, unbreakable spirit that had dragged him back from the brink. He rested his forehead against Scout's. "Sentinel," he whispered, the name a vow. "My Scout." The dog sighed, a deep, shuddering breath of release, and leaned heavily into him. The past was unpacked, raw and real. Now they faced it together. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves a near-death, a hero dog, and a veteran who keeps to himself. By the time Ben and Scout were discharged from the clinic 2 days later, Ben still weak but steady, Scout's scrapes cleaned and gleaming with ointment, the story had already woven itself into the fabric of the community, taking on a life of its own. It wasn't just gossip. It was a shared exhale of relief, followed by a quiet, collective decision. Hank met them at the clinic door, his grizzled face unusually solemn. He didn't say much, just clapped Ben carefully on the shoulder, nodded at Scout, "Good dog," and drove them home in silence thick with unspoken understanding. But when they pulled up to the farmhouse, Ben stopped cold. Parked beside his own truck was Doc Evans's Vetmobile, Hank's battered pickup, Dave's mud-splattered SUV, and 3 other vehicles he recognized from neighbors down the valley. A cluster of people stood near the barn door, talking in low tones. "What's all this?" Ben asked, his voice still a little rough. Hank cut the engine. "Folks heard," he said simply, getting out. "About the heater, about the dog." Ben stepped out, Scout instantly pressing against his leg, ears pricked forward, body taut but curious. As they approached, the group turned. Doc Evans, Dave, Mrs. Gable from the post office, the young couple who ran the organic dairy down the road, and a few others Ben knew by sight, if not name. Their expressions weren't pitying. They were determined. Doc Evans stepped forward, holding a large sealed mason jar. It wasn't empty. It was stuffed to the brim with bills, 20s, 10s, crumpled 5s, even a few folded hundreds peeking through the glass. "Ben," she said, her voice clear in the cold air. "We had a little talk. That relic heater nearly killed you. Nearly killed Scout trying to save you. Ain't happening again." She thrust the jar towards him. "For a new one, a proper, safe, modern heating system for that barn. For you and those sheep, and," she nodded at Scout, "for him." Ben stared at the jar, the sheer weight of it in her hands, mirroring the sudden weight in his chest. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Dave stepped up then, holding a faded blue envelope. "My granddad left me this," he said, his voice thick. "Always meant it for something important." He placed the envelope on top of the jar in Doc Evans' hands. The corner of a check peeked out, the amount handwritten in careful, looping script. It was significant. Then Old Man Peterson shuffled forward, leaning heavily on his cane. Ben knew him mostly by reputation, a stoic, near-silent fixture who'd worked his land alone since his wife passed decades ago. He didn't carry a jar or an envelope. He reached into the pocket of his overalls, pulled out a thick, rubber-banded roll of worn bills. Pension money, Ben knew. Peterson peeled off half the roll, a stack that represented years of careful saving. He didn't say anything to Ben. He looked down at Scout, who met his gaze steadily. "Lost my boy in Iraq?" Peterson rasped, the words scraped raw. "Vets stick together." He placed the stack on the growing pile in Doc Evans's arms, gave Scout's head a single, stiff pat, and turned away, blinking hard. The donations kept coming over the next week. It wasn't just money. Carl from the hardware store delivered brand-new CO detectors, one for the barn, one for the house, and refused payment. "Consider it a safety inspection," he grunted. The high school shop class, led by their grizzled teacher, Mr. Hendricks, a Vietnam vet who'd nodded curtly at Ben when he heard the story, offered to handle the installation of the new heating unit, free of labor. "Good project for the kids," Hendricks stated. "Practical." Then came the lemonade stand, or rather, the hot cocoa stand, set up bravely at the end of Ben's long driveway one bitingly cold Saturday morning. Two of Dave's kids, bundled like colorful ticks, and little Mia Gable, her nose red above her scarf, manned a rickety card table. A hand-painted sign, letters wobbling with childish earnestness, declared, "Scoot's Header Fund." Hot cocoa, 50 cents. They'd misspelled Scout's name and heater, but the intent shone brighter than the winter sun. They waved frantically as cars slowed. Hank stopped by 3 times, each time drinking a tiny paper cup of watery cocoa and dropping in a 20. Ben watched from the porch, Scout sitting alertly beside him as the kids jumped up and down with each donation, their breath puffing like eager steam engines. When they finally packed up, frostbitten but triumphant, they brought a coffee can full of coins and small bills up to the porch. "For Scout's heater," Mia announced proudly, holding the heavy can out to Ben. Scout gently nosed her mittened hand, eliciting a giggle. The coffee can held maybe $15. It felt like a fortune. The new heater wasn't a relic. It was a sleek, efficient unit mounted high on the barn wall, humming with quiet assurance. The shop-class kids, under Hendricks's watchful eye, had run the vents perfectly, installed the detectors, and cleaned up every scrap. The barn smelled of fresh wiring and sawdust, overlaying the familiar scents of hay and animals. The pregnant ewes huddled contentedly in their pen, bathed in safe, warm air. That first evening after the installation was complete, Ben stood at the barn door, the cold Idaho night pressing in. He held the heavy door open. Beside him, Scout looked up, then at the brightly lit interior. Ben held his breath. The memories of terror, of poison and panic were still raw for both of them. Scout sniffed the air deeply. His ears, usually one cocked, both swiveled forward. His tail, held low and tense, gave a single, tentative wag. Then another. He looked up at Ben, his dark eyes searching, questioning. "It's safe, Scout," Ben whispered, his voice thick. "It's safe now, because of you, because of them." Scout held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a soft woof, he stepped forward. Not skittering, not lunging, but walking deliberately into the barn. His tail began to wag in earnest, sweeping a slow, steady arc through the air. He walked past the ewes, who barely lifted their heads, past the tractor, past the stacked hay bales that no longer looked like cliffs. He walked right up to the spot where the old heater had stood, now just a clean patch of concrete. He sniffed it thoroughly, carefully. Then he turned, looked back at Ben still standing in the doorway, and gave a single, clear, happy bark. "Come in." Ben stepped over the threshold. The warmth was immediate, comforting, clean. He walked to where Scout stood. He didn't kneel this time. He just stood there, looking down at his dog, the hero, the savior, the friend who had fought invisible monsters and won. The tears came then, hot and sudden, blurring the clean lines of the new heater, the contented sheep, the steadfast dog. They traced icy paths down his wind-chapped cheeks before freezing in the warmth of the barn. He reached out, his hand trembling only slightly, and rested it firmly on Scout's head, feeling the solid skull beneath the fur, the living warmth. "Good boy," Ben choked out, the words catching on the lump in his throat. "My good, brave boy." Scout leaned heavily into his leg, the full weight of his trust and contentment pressing against Ben. He sighed, a deep rumbling sound of utter peace, his eyes half closing. The low hum of the new heater filled the space where fear and poison had once lurked. It was the sound of safety, the sound of home. Later, after the final checks, Ben sat on an upturned bucket near the sheep pen, bone-tired but profoundly at ease. Scout lay stretched out on the warm concrete floor near the gently radiating heater, his breathing deep and even in sleep. One ear twitched occasionally, still listening, always on duty, but his body was utterly relaxed, a picture of hard-won peace. Ben watched the rise and fall of the dog's chest, the rhythmic pulse of life he'd come so close to losing. He reached out, his calloused hand coming to rest gently on Scout's side, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his palm, strong and sure. Outside, the Idaho wind howled, scouring the frozen fields. Inside the barn, warmed by kindness and guarded by a once-broken sentinel, the world felt whole. Ben kept his hand on Scout's chest, a silent vow echoing in the quiet hum of the heater and the deep, even breaths of the dog who had brought him back from the cold.